Board members, if we can get you to take your seats, we're going to get started. And for those that can hear me, there's a white Cadillac outside with your flashers on. The horn's not honking, but the flashers are on or something. Oh, everybody got it? No, it's not yours, Scott. Nope, not yours. I know it's not mine, so. All right, well, they'll just flash away. One more call for board members. If you'll take your seats, we'll. All right. We get all the. Okay, I think I have the mics on. Yes, I do. All right, we're going to turn the time over to Chief of Staff Tiffany Stanley, who will introduce our speakers today, and been looking forward to this update. And then will you also share with the board on your expectations of how your presentation and when you want questions and et cetera. I don't know if you'll have pause moments for those or seek them, but
Yes.
we've got a lot to cover, so the time is yours.
Okay, thank you. So we appreciate this opportunity to review an interim report of the education funding study that we've contracted with WestEd to conduct. Before I introduce WestEd, who will walk through the findings from their initial investigations, I wanted to provide a refresher for you on the origins of this study, some of the key activities over the past year, and then what's next. Back in early spring, the board voted to direct staff to engage with a researcher to conduct a comprehensive education funding study. As discussed at the time, and continues to be the case, the overall objective of this study is to really examine the extent to which the state's education funding system is continuing to meet the evolving needs of students within our state. Really, our system was designed in the 70s and hasn't been substantially reviewed since the 90s, so we saw it as very timely to take a comprehensive look at our system. As opposed to continuing to tinker at the edges, to really look at it from a systems design perspective. So after the board authorized the study back in the spring, we met with legislators, LEA reps, and other stakeholders to develop the scope of work with the goal of developing research objectives and asking questions that are relevant to decision makers. Then we put the study out for RFP, and WestEd ended up being selected through that process. The board approved the contract in June, and since then, WestEd's been hard at work completing this initial context setting analysis detailed in the report that they'll be reviewing with you today. So the next phase leading up to the final report is where the more in-depth, rigorous analyses will be conducted to not only tell us the what. This initial phase is really telling us, is descriptive in telling us the what, but it will also tell us the why, which is really critical to inform policymaking. So our plan and process moving forward, leading up to the final report being published in November, would be to release findings of those analyses in phases, so that those findings have time to be really reviewed and considered, and things aren't just bundled up into one final report late in the session, because the intent is, or late in the year, because the intent is that these findings could inform policymaking for the next general session in 2021. With that, I will hand it over to WestEd. We have Jason Willis and Justin Silverstein from APA, who will walk through the study, and they'll also cover how they'd like to handle questions. So,
great, thanks. And just logistical on PowerPoint.
Yes,
Are you gonna? Yep. Okay, great. Well, good morning, everybody. A pleasure to have an opportunity to present before you this morning. As I said, or as Tiffany introduced, my name is Jason Willis. I'm a Director of Strategy and Performance with WestEd, leading up the study in addition to our partners at APA. Justin Silverstein, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Justin Silverstein, the co-CEO of APA, and we're a Denver-based education policy consulting firm.
So a little bit about introductions there. So a couple of objectives for today. As Tiffany previewed, we really want to be able to spend some time with you all in presenting some of the findings from this first report, really intended to be interim, set the context of what we know about Utah over the course of the last several months. We'll talk a little bit about some of the developmental process for the report, the findings from each of the significant phases, questions that we investigated in this initial step, and then some of the implications in next step, laying out some of the work that'll be happening throughout the course of the remainder of this calendar year. In terms of the QA, to the chair's question, we're happy to take questions, a few questions. We'll pause between each of the substantial sections, but we, as the chair indicated, we've got a lot to get through, so we want to be mindful and respectful of your time, and we'll reserve about 15 or 20 minutes at the very end for other general questions. So let's get started. So this kind of lays out the two areas of the study investigation for the scope that was approved by this board. Today we'll be talking about those 5 bullets on the left-hand side of the screen under phase 1, identifying the core components of the minimum school program, talking about the role and balance of state and local contributions to public education, discussing some of the results of the equity analyses that were conducted by our partners at APA. And then we'll round out our presentation this morning discussing the kind of method of counting students and some of the investigations and findings that were raised through that, as well as a look at year-round schooling review. We'll talk more about some of the phase 2 things. You can see some of the activities that are listed. Suffice it to say that those things will be going significantly deeper than this first phase, both quantitatively and qualitatively, resulting in a series of findings and conclusions that this board and other policymakers here in the state of Utah may use with thinking about changes to its school funding formula going forward. So this is a look at our process and methodology. You can see each of the parts distinguished on the left-hand side under the task, and then the research questions, the 5 research objectives that were tied to each of the bullets that I previously noted. You can see on this slide we discuss each of the types of methods that we used in collecting information around each of those tasks, either document review, stakeholder input, or some series of data analysis. In every single one of these cases, one of the things we value at WestEd in terms of our research approach is always thinking about triangulating the data collection, so never using a single source of data, but always looking to ensure that what we're looking at, we can come at from a number of different lenses in validating some of the findings and conclusions that we're surfacing for, in this case, the state of Utah. So let's jump right in. This is the first component around identifying the minimum school program. This is the organizational framework that we used in making this assessment. It was really looking at how is the minimum school program, the program of funding here in Utah, aligned to the different priorities and the different activities that school districts and the state are performing. And we lay it out as, and I'll work backwards here from right to left. So starting with measures of success. What are those success indicators? How is Utah measuring its progress on the things that they care about, success for students in particular? And then outcomes, thinking about the results that you want to get, and sometimes, and in the case of Utah, are defined less than, say, a metric, but in thinking about the results for students. Where do you want them to be at the end of their time in formal schooling? We also look at, as a part of this organizational framework, the programs, policies, and practices, what you would describe as inputs. So you think about things like teachers or curriculum. Those are all considerations of inputs here in the organizational framework. And then finally, what kind of brings this all together is thinking about core components or categories of inputs, multiples of them, that are linked to the outputs that are necessary. So Substantially in this kind of first set of research tasks, this is just a sampling of some of the sources that we used, looking at obviously this board's strategic direction going forward, pulling together RISE, Utah's core standards. I think also substantially in this investigation, talking a lot with stakeholders here in the state of Utah, district superintendents, chief financial officers, charter school leaders, really trying to get a sense of what their perspective is on the alignment between the activities that they're being asked to do on a day-to-day basis, and the way that the funding program is designed to support those types of activities. And so if we look at the outputs and outcomes, that vision should look very familiar to you all here in the board. And that the results are really defined around the portrait of a graduate and that vision for Utah's State Board of Education. And I think importantly in thinking about the outputs and outcomes for students, it was very clearly defined in a portrait of graduate that identifies the ideal characteristics of a Utah graduate after going through the K-12 system. So it gives you a sense of that output or outcome that you're looking for students going through the system. And measures of success, which are some ways in which Utah thinks about the measurement of that portrait of a graduate. You can see some of them displayed here. In thinking about the Education Elevated 2020 targets, you obviously also have your state-adopted math and ELA assessments. You also have graduation rates. There's lots of other indicators you use. These are substantial, kind of tied to the things you both care about and report out on a day-to-day basis, or I'm sorry, on over time. And further, that those measured targets are addressing, as we surfaced, equity gaps that are occurring here in the state of Utah, either between racial and ethnic groups or social classes within the state of Utah. So from an inputs perspective, these are some of the documents that really I think fed the collection of inputs here. So obviously your strategies that are laid out in your strategic plan, your state adopted standards, and your associated kind of scope and sequence that are guiding the kind of programs on a range of disciplines by subject here in Utah. But also to really match that, as I was discussing earlier, having substantial conversations with superintendents, chief financial officers around their perspectives, as well as charter leaders on how the portrait of a graduate, those set of goals, are tied to your inputs, your outcomes, and ultimately the output, what you're looking for in every student that's graduating from a Utah school here in the state. And so in consideration of all of that, that review that we conducted, further detail can be found in the information in front of you. And I'll take a moment to pause and go through those materials. But in thinking about the findings for this part of the research task, kind of first and foremost, that stakeholder expectations and the state endorsed documents reflect a general common definition of the minimum school program. So we saw a fairly good alignment between how stakeholders, your practitioners, your state endorsed documents were aligned to the ways in which you're currently funding schools and school districts here in the state of Utah. Social emotional learning and mental health supports are the exception. That was a gap that we saw in our research. And this was particularly true of stakeholders supporting the kind of expanded integration of both learning about social emotional learning into the kind of core academic program, but also how those resources show up in schools. So think a social worker or a counselor and their availability to schools and school districts in the state of Utah. So this just gives you a look at some of the core components as we define them in the report itself, some of the subcomponents as well. Most of this should look very familiar given the work of the board. And just to spend another moment on this idea of the kind of social, emotional, and mental health supports in some of that context. This has been a national trend where many states have gotten very interested in the work of social emotional learning and really wanting to figure out ways that it can be integrated with academic core content. And that has been an area of further development. So where we see states in kind of their early maturity on this, they typically tend to think about the social emotional learning component as a kind of separate element, something that has to happen in a separate block outside of your core academic learning. Some of your more sophisticated states in the union really have thought about that integration, so that teachers are able to build that and weave that into some of the core content delivery that creates a bit more effectiveness and efficiency in terms of delivery. And finally, that stakeholders really also highlighted the need for expanded mental health support for their communities. This also reflects a national trend that we've seen across the country, in that there have been a rising series of other environmental and contextual circumstances where kids are coming to school presenting needs that need to be addressed, and that schools in the past historically may not have necessarily been equipped to really handle and deal with. And so schools and school districts are really thinking about the design of the way that they want to address those challenges. So here are just a couple of the implications for phase 2. This in particular is going to inform the assessment on distinguishing monetary versus non-monetary resources, and the successful schools investigation that our partners at APA will be conducting. And also is going to inform some of the analysis of variation in cost by environmental context. So the statistical analysis that we're using to look at and assess what's happening here in Utah, this gives us some very early indication of some of the design principles we want to set up in the quantitative analysis that would indicate some of the questions that we want to be asking of the data in a later phase. So I apologize earlier I didn't give you a preview of the materials that were in front of you. Each of you should have a shorter document, substantially thinner than the second. This is essentially just an executive summary of both the overall report, but also of the components that we're reviewing today. Consider this your cheat sheet, your cliff notes on the fuller interim report that you have in front of you. You also have a copy for your late night reading if you'd like to go through that as well. This is a kind of full detail on our work in this first phase of the report. So I'll pause there and I'll defer to the chair if there's any questions that members have, and then we'll move into the next section.
Questions from board members? I'm not seeing any. Oh, board member Lair.
I don't know if this is a question, or sort of it is, because I want to know if you looked at it or if this came up in any of the research on other states. But your discussion, I thought, was helpful about the social emotional learning. But I've observed over the last, 10 years, even before this became the flavor of the month, that there's a catch-22 for educators given Utah law, and that is that we've got the section about what's been called Utah FERPA, or restraining educators from talking to students about many personal topics.
Yep.
And they finally the legislature created an exception to that a couple of years ago for suicidal
Yep.
ideation. But that's the only sliver, which is sort of taken out of context. It means if the student I read it to say, if the student does this one thing, then that could allow the educator to talk to the student more about their social emotional well-being or mindset or whatever. So I don't know if that, I don't think, from what I know and what I've read, is that the Utah law is more extreme, more limited for what teachers can say to students in any state I've seen. Although that there's a part of called the Pupil Protection Act that's part of federal FERPA,
Yep.
but is similar but not as restrictive as Utah's. I don't know if that came up in your situation, because I don't think we can fix that integration suggestion until that law is it unties the hands of educators, and then there's some good arguments for not doing that. So
Yeah.
what do you think about that?
Yeah, so to address your question directly, we didn't do an analysis on Utah's student data privacy law in comparison to other states, but the point you bring up is a common barrier, challenge that other states are trying to figure out in providing these kinds of supports appropriately into schools. And so a couple of approaches have been to try and go at the law directly to say, are there places in which you could open up and have school personnel, teachers, assistant principals, directly engage students. And there's been some examples of that across the country. One of the other things that we've seen emerge is the presence of like school health clinics or kind of community schools emerge, so that you're placing other professionals that do have ready access to that and other licensed training to be able to directly interact with those students. And what we see in those types of examples across the country is that the teachers or the other school personnel are not necessarily directly responsible for engaging, so they're not breaking any kind of state or federal law in regards to student privacy, but what they receive training in is cues, like things to look for around certain behavior that might be uncharacteristic of the student as they know them coming into the environment. And so that might trigger a referral by the teacher to the school health clinic to then have a mental health professional, for example, engage with the student.
Just a quick follow-up.
Okay.
Was there any state or program that you thought that seemed particularly successful or promising, or were you even able to look at that?
That was a very cursory review, but I can certainly take that question specifically back to the team and then provide that information to Tiffany and the staff.
I think until we resolve that in Utah, we are not going to be able to really meaningfully address student emotional health, because teachers feel like their hands are tied, and it's a little bit their perception, but it's mostly the law's breadth. So, thanks.
I'm not seeing any other questions or comments, so please continue.
Okay. So we'll keep moving so into part two to talk a little bit about the alignment with respect to fulfilling statutory purpose and some of the evidence-based practices. This may look familiar to some of you in the room. This is a breakout of your minimum school program, your school funding program here in the state of Utah, and the proportion of resources that fall into the three major categories or buckets, as we would describe them. The basic school program, which really is your kind of regular program, your core program for funding schools and districts in the state. You've also got some restricted programs in there, some very specific activities that you as a state feel are important to ensure in that basic school program. That is the lion's share at 65%. You've got some related to basic school program elements at 18.5%. So again, these are related, tangential, may focus on certain populations. You have those designations for some of your populations, low income EL. But this bucket also supports other statewide initiatives and educator supports that you provide. And then the last is the 16.5% for voted and kind of board local levies. So obviously, by its name, includes both voted and board levies, as well as the kind of board local levy around early literacy. This is a look, a trend graph over the last 5 years of your per pupil revenue. And we broke it out into each of those three programs. A couple things to note here on this graph is that we've seen a larger year-over-year increase in your related to basic school program, particularly over the last couple of years, and your voted and board local levies than we have with the basic school program. I think it's important also to denote that for your basic school program and your related to basic school program, those are operated by the state. The state has the control, the ability to think about how those things are categorized, the amount of funding that go into each of those, which is distinguishable from your voted and board local levies, in that your localities, you have some constraints around equalization and things like that, but generally the localities are making those decisions around resources that are coming into their schools. And what we can observe is that over the last 5 years, that rate of change has been going a lot faster than those that are really under state control. I think it's also important to remember about a graph in particular like this, that there's quite a bit of variation that happens from district to district underneath of this. Like this does reflect an overall state average here in the state of Utah. And Justin will talk a little bit more about that during some of the equity analysis review. So some of our findings here is that we find that the structure of the minimum school program fulfills that statutory purpose by delineating the different channels of funding, some of it being less restrictive than others. We find, again, the kind of most significant area of misalignment is around social-emotional learning, strongly represented as a priority, but not perceived to be sufficiently or formally supported in the current system. One of the things, just to preview some considerations for this, is some states have really been thinking about more cross-sector work. For example, there are sets of resources that all states, will channel towards health and human services, and they show up in communities as mental health, behavioral health supports for any variety of families and their parents and children. And so thinking about that kind of cross-sector collaboration has been something that many states have been contemplating as they're running up against the inability to kind of raise as much revenue as they would like going forward. So the impact of funding changes in other states, we want to just preview a little bit of some of the recent research that's been coming out nationally. First and foremost, we find that the independent literature is showing that there is links between increased school spending to positive outcomes for students. You can see some of the outcomes there listed in terms of higher graduation rates, increased college attendance, and higher lifetime wages. This is particularly striking when resources are directed towards high-need populations. So when states, for example, are saying, we want to send resources to a student that is low income, or we want to send resources to a student that is EL, some of the increased outcomes for those students are coming for those special need populations, which is really validating this notion that when funding systems are designed to both fund, every general education student and then differentiate on the type of dollars that are going to student need populations, and subsequently districts and schools then use those dollars to create resources for those students, it's having a positive impact on outcomes for those students. For the second bullet there, you can see that that this also has context, right? That on average, money does matter, but not necessarily in every context, in every setting, in all school districts. This really reflects the complexity of the school environment, the fact that when students come to school settings, that they show up with a set of circumstances that are sometimes wildly different than their peers, and managing that in a complex system that is primarily driven by people. We're a people business. Is important to take into context when you're asking some of these questions. And that other kind of non-monetary factors such as family or community experience can really have an impact on that student success. And we have been able to kind of begin to pull apart those things that we're finding to be really impactful, not just with all students, but with certain sets of populations and certain sets of circumstances. So we wanted to just review a couple of the approaches to targeting these investments. So from the state perspective, how might a state think about its targeting of investments to propel practitioners at the district or the school level to think about the allocation of those resources? So one very popular one is really around categorical programs. So these are restricted dollars for designated programs that may support, and Justin will talk a little bit about, again, this concept of vertical equity through accountability. The cost on that side is not cost in terms of dollars necessarily, but what is the drawback or limitation perhaps, but you have some kind of burdensome requirements that are maybe associated with those categories and some limited flexibility in the use of discretion at the local level. One other, I would say, surging popularity that we've seen in states, but also in a subset of larger school systems in the country, is this reference to weighted student formulas. So it really provides additional funds or weights to a certain set of characteristics of students on a per pupil basis. So as I was describing, if you gave, for example, $3,000 per kid to every general ed student, a weighted student formula would say for every low income student, you would give that $3,000 plus some other marginal amount, recognizing that student needs additional resources to drive positive outcomes in that environment. And the structure of those really do vary across state to state, some of that environmental context, but is really rooted in the research around thinking about the weighting categorization itself. We have seen this emergence that when states move to these weighted student formulas, they They are wrestling with how to set up the appropriate types of accountabilities for asking school districts and schools to follow through with funds getting to those higher need populations. But some of that has been rapidly evolving over the course of the last 3 years that we're finding a lot of fairly good lessons learned. The last kind of approach that we generally see is this a block grant. So it's an entirely unrestricted set of resources that are provided to districts. Again, it may support that kind of vertical equity through accountability, but depending on the requirements that you build around it, may be quite burdensome to the locality. But one of the things that comes in this mechanism of distribution is also thinking about what are the set of supports and monitoring opportunities that the state is creating with school districts in order to ensure that these resources are used and spent well. So a little bit of the implications for phase 2. This really does set up a lot of our deeper quantitative analysis that we are anticipating over the course of the next 3 to 4 months, looking at the impact of these different programs on certain populations. I was mentioning earlier that that the weightings that would come along with a weighted student formula are something that states are using. That is something that we have built into our analysis for the cost function. And continuing to look at the mechanisms by which targeted funding is provided, including this state and local balance. We got to a certain level around that analysis in this portion of the work with you all, but we'll be going into a deeper analysis around equalization. So that'll conclude our second piece. And again, for the chair, if there's any questions, happy to take those before I turn it over to Justin.
Okay. Questions from board members? Board Member Lear?
Sorry. I really didn't read every word of this, so don't think that I'm being obsessive. But I'm kind of a fan of block granting, but I wondered if in your review you've seen, is that increasing, or is that a decreasing practice among other SEAs? Do you know?
We've seen, I would say, a slight downward trend. I think the popularity really has been around weighted student formulas, in particular because what it helps to do is segment and signal to local school districts that there's a set of resources that should be used for all students. Consider that the core component that I was describing earlier. But there's also a set of resources that the state wants to ensure is explicitly going to students of need. The block grant would not allow for that kind of distinction, nor the kind of tracking and understanding of how those funding is being used to advance students with those types of background and characteristics.
Or just to follow up 1 second, I don't know if I'd say it wouldn't allow for it, but it certainly doesn't encourage that. It leaves LEAs to sort of make their own choices about.
That's true. So you could have a circumstance under a block grant system in which you said, we're going to provide this block grant and it's got your base plus dollars for these explicit 3 sets of students. You could have, dozens of different weighting schemes that may not be necessarily attached to what we either find in Utah or is tied to national research.
So for instance, in Salt Lake, and I represent Salt Lake City, a lot of the block granting funds, if it was just generally block granted, would go to those needs because that's a great need in a very urban place like Salt Lake. But Alpine might not address their lower income or more specialized needs because the general population of students probably is, the tax base is low and the general population of students is
Yeah,
great.
I mean, so in a block grant circumstance, you have a lot more of that flexibility for that to occur, and you really are deferring the discretion to the school district to think about how they distribute those resources. Even in a weighted student formula scheme, you've got a little bit more constraints. So maybe one way to think about it is on a continuum. Your categorical is the most constrained mechanism by which distributing funds, because the dollar is set and it's set for a certain purpose. The weighted student formula provides a little bit more flexibility than the categorical, but it still says there's a set of resources that you intend to get to a certain set of student. And the block grant is from a funding distribution mechanism, probably the most general way or most loose way in which to distribute funds to districts.
But as you noted, that's hard to monitor, to see if it really gets to those specialized populations.
Yes, that's correct.
Thanks.
Are you done then?
I am playing,
Okay.
yeah, finally.
All right. Board Member Earl?
Just a quick comment, so thank you. This was a hard read, by the way. So about halfway through, I told my kids, set the alarm for 30 minutes and I'll be back up, because I went to sleep, so. But I do enjoy the numbers. And it's always interesting when we say equity, because it depends on what we're measuring. And the only reason why I say that is I'm from Morgan, a little community up this direction, but when you look at, like on page 40, we are the bottom for funding in our community. And so, you know, we could cry, we want, you know, a more equitable distribution of funding so that we can pay our teachers more and stuff. But then there are advantages to, do you know what I mean? So it's always like, it's interesting to talk equity, because in some ways you have different experiences within your community. We don't have a lot of business. So therefore, there's some element of, you know, funding that we don't receive because of that. So it's really hard to sort out what equity is really equitable. Does that make sense? And at what point do certain communities get more funding, because maybe more needs? I don't know. It all depends on the community. So I don't know, and I even debated on saying anything, but really that idea of equity, we have to be careful that we don't use it to a disadvantage for some communities and an advantage for others, to where it does create, a disproportionate amount. I know, and like I said, just because I'm familiar with my community, you know, there's some real struggles to keep teachers because we don't get as much funding, and therefore they can easily leave, go to Davis or, you know, other communities, because there's a greater funding base. Anyway, just a general comment there. Being real careful as we do equity, that we're not creating an inequitable situation for other communities. As we're trying to equalize everything, we sometimes end up with maybe other problems in other communities, so.
And Board Member, I certainly appreciate the comment. I think it's a great transition actually to Justin's presentation. And I think for the sake of helping you all as policymakers to think about those discussions, we'll go over our definition, how we thought about the definition of equity in this phase of the analysis.
And as this is moving forward and being able to be a part of this at the very beginning, that's a really good point, Board Member Earl, about equity. But this study that is being performed is just not for our benefit. It's for the legislature, it's for local boards, because they all play we all play a role, and on this funding side, and parents play a role in it where they choose to live and that. But this is a really good comprehensive reality check that we're trying to make here, which the stakeholders are just more than just us. So I'm not seeing any other questions or comments, so please continue.
So the next slide is going to look like we had an audience plant, because the first thing we really do want to talk about is what do we mean when we say equity as part of this study. Because if you walk into any room and you say, how do you define equity, and then how do you define equity, you're going to probably have, if we have 40 people in the room, 40 slightly different versions of how they define equity. But within the context of this study and school finance in general, there's a pretty discrete box on what we're looking at when we talk about equity. And so the first thing that we're talking about here when we talk about equity or resource equity is, how aligned is your distribution of dollars for K-12 ed to the legislative purpose? How well does that distribution account for the differences you see both in districts and student characteristics? And then how well does that distribution ensure that there are sufficient resources to meet really the goals, expectations within your education policy structure? So that's the kind of overarching piece. And then when we think about actually measuring it, school finance literature for 50 years has, has a construct on how we measure looking at variation in equity. And the first is horizontal equity. And so how well do we treat those who are similar? So if you have two students or districts in very similar circumstances, you would expect that they are treated relatively similarly within the distribution of resources in your system. Vertical equity starts talking about how well do we treat the differences that are faced either by districts or students. So if you have a district who is smaller or larger, if you have a district that has higher geographic costs, but more in our study, specifically on students, if you have a higher needs population, how well does the system take into account that your district has higher needs versus another district that might have lower needs? Now, of course, we'll talk about how we define student need, because that is, again, something you have to define as you start to look at this. And then the last piece is fiscal neutrality, which in its most basic sense is, as a student, where you live should not dictate the level of resource available to you for your education. So how closely tied is the wealth of a community to the overall level of resources that they have to serve their students? As was mentioned, it can get a little deep when you start looking at all the equity analysis, and we just want to frame a couple of the key terms. The first, for every district in the state, we created a need factor. That need factor basically is just a representation of the percentage of overall student need in that district relative to a 1.0, which would mean you have no students who are special education, no students who are low income, and no students who are English language learners. So no district has that. But there is variation across this state and every state when you start to look at that. And that need factor is generated by looking at what we call a weighted ADM. And so we assign an additional amount of resource need that is related to specific student characteristics. We're doing this by looking at national research and our national, having done this in all 50 states over 30 years. And so for low-income students, we're weighting those students 35%, English learners 0.5, and students with disability 1.1. Again, to look at the additional resources that might be needed for those students to meet similar educational outcomes. And then below that are the types of analysis or statistics we're using. We're looking at the range. When you're looking at equity, larger range often suggests that there's some inequity in the system. Coefficient of variation, which is looking at how much variation is within the distribution of a statistic. In this case, and in the school finance research, if the coefficient of variation is over a 0.10, we start to believe that there is more variation than you would like to see in the system. We have the Mcloon and Verstegen indices, which are two professors who came up with basically the same measure. One measures the bottom half of the distribution, and the other measures the top half of the distribution, but both professors got their own indices. And then there's the correlation coefficient, which is simply a correlation. And in this case, we'll be looking at it mostly with fiscal neutrality. And what we're looking at is the relationship between wealth, as measured as per pupil wealth, and then the different revenues and expenditure figures. And if we start to see a correlation that's over 0.5, we start to think that there's some issues with the equity of the system. So the key measures we look at on the financial side are the state and local revenues per ADM. And every time you see ADM, you can also think of weighted ADM, because we're going to look at both. The total revenue per pupil, so that adds in those federal resources, total expenditures per pupil, and then separately the instructional expenditures per ADM. And then the other resources we're looking at are teacher salary and that variation. The teachers per 1,000 ADM, we use that because the higher the teachers per 1,000, the more staff you have per student. Sometimes people like to look at pupil-teacher ratios, and it goes the other direction, so it can get a little confusing. The lower the number, the better. Here, it goes the other way. Similarly, certified staff per 1,000 ADM, and then we do use that student-teacher ratio. There are limitations to this study. The first is that we are using some national weights. It could be, and we're going to learn more from the cost function analysis, what the actual relationships are or should be here in Utah. And so it could be that 0.35, the 0.5, or the 1.1 might not be the exact weights we should be using here. in the state, but they are the kind of nationally accepted weights for this type of study, so that's what we started with. As you know, there's only a handful of states who have less districts than Utah does, and you have a huge variation in size within those districts. So having few districts and having large variation, both of those make equity analysis a little harder. You have both. And one of the things we have not done yet is seeing the impacts that the board and voted leeways have on equity analysis. So part of phase 2 is we'll actually kind of take those dollars in and out of our analysis to see just how much it changes our metrics that we're going to talk about in a minute, which will give us some sense of where, if there are any equity issues, that's kind of being driven within the overall revenue structure. So some of the results. So horizontal equity. So again, examining if places that are similar, is there a lot of variation? And it turns out on the financial coefficients of variation, all of them are well above the 0.1 threshold, and they have generally improved over time, but again, have stayed over that 0.1. On the other kind of non-financial metrics, other than the average teacher salary, again, all of the key measures we're looking at are above that 0.10. And the Mcloon and Verstegen indices both failed to meet the threshold, though Verstegen has improved over time. So your variation in your wealthier communities is actually decreased over time, but on the less wealthy, that hasn't happened. So one of the things that could be true is that you have a lot of variation horizontally because you actually have a lot of variation in your characteristics, especially of students. So it could be that you actually have a relatively inequitable horizontal system because you just have a lot of variation in need across your districts, which would mean when you turn to vertical equity, you would actually see the system get better. That could be. It didn't happen. But that's one of the things we want to look at. And so that's why you start to look at vertical equity. Say, okay, well, perhaps the differences are because the need. Turns out that the figure stayed similar or got a little bit worse in some cases. There wasn't quite the same trend line. And so even when you take into account those student variation, you didn't see an increase in equity in the system. And in fact, over time, there's been some decrease in equity. Some of the coefficients are actually getting worse, not better. Fiscal neutrality is actually a place where the state is much closer to that 0.5 threshold in most of what we've looked at. There's some places where it's a little below, a number where it's over, but most of the time it's right around that 0.5. So you're right at the cusp generally of not meeting those fiscal neutrality ratios that we'd want to see. And that is true on everything except the student-teacher ratio. So this is just a summary, again, of all the measures that we have. Only the average teacher salary met the standard for horizontal equity. The formula does not provide the sufficient additional resources for students with greater needs, and so we didn't see an improvement when we looked at vertical equity. And you're not way out there by any means, but you're right at that tipping point. You might want to have some concern on your fiscal neutrality. Wanted to bring up a couple things. You all are probably familiar with a number of studies done by other groups who actually find Utah's system to be pretty equitable. We list this pretty clearly both in the summary and in the report. Those studies are different than what we looked at. Partly they're using national data to compare states. We're using your actual, the statewide data provided by the department. They also only look at the equity difference for poverty students. They don't take into account English learners and your students with disabilities. So it's not really an apples to apples comparison, but it's not to say that those analyses, which are good analyses, don't show that parts of your system really are doing a good job. It's just when we bring in a little bit more detail, we're finding some areas that are of more concern. So what does this mean for phase 2? First piece, and Jason already mentioned that, is that the cost functions are going to give us a little bit more detail on those actual relationships for those 3 student categories, and so that can help us refine this work a little bit. And additionally, we're going to do a little bit more, because I have an accounting degree, I'll say it this way, kind of variance analysis as we go forward, trying to think through as you put in and take out certain parts of your revenue system, where do we start to see some of these equity issues get highlighted? So we now know that the we need to come back to you with what we think is the why. So we can take questions on this section.
Okay, questions or comments? I'm enjoying, I'll say that, but I've been a part of that process a little bit. And, Board Member Davis.
At the risk of embarrassing myself after that, all of that explanation. So back to her question. So you're saying there is a piece that is going to be included in this that looks at a variety of groups of students, but also looks at equity between, for example, you know, a resources per student in a Daggett or a Paiute versus a Morgan district. For all students, there is going to be an equity piece assessed in that area as well. Is that what you're telling us?
Let me start, and I think Jason might want to add something. Within the report, we actually break out the information in quintiles, and so you can actually look based on, especially on wealth and need, the relationships, you know, based on those district characteristics to what they're getting in revenues and expenditures. So we already taking a look at that some. What we want to do is peel the onion a little bit. Right now, we're looking at all the dollars together, all the revenues together. We want to get a really specific understanding of within the overall structure. When you think of the earlier graph that had your basic, you know, basic allotments and the related and the leeway, what are the impacts of each of those on equity, both generally and then within those quintiles also?
Yeah, follow up.
Okay, so just, I don't know if you make recommendations or you only do analyses, but, so, for example, if there was something determined that there needed to be more resources for students with special needs per se, then what would be taken into account is the current resources that are already going to that student, the differences between a Morgan and a, you know, Park City, and then those amounts would be adjusted, taking into account all of the equity factors, not just, you know, every student with special needs across the board needs this additional resource, and they will be given that even though that particular student in Park City is already at a difference than a student in Morgan.
Yes,
Okay.
is the short answer, but let me unpack that a little bit more. And just for reference, page 91 of the full report has the breakdown of quintiles on the equity factors that Justin just reviewed. So, Member Davis, to go into a little bit more detail, the next one of the activities in the next phase of the analysis is what we refer to in the field as a cost function analysis. And simply, in the most simple terms, we are taking a tremendous amount of Utah's own data, very diverse, thinking about financial data, school characteristics, student characteristic information, regional variations in cost, and we're putting it into a model. And we are then assessing different relationships of those variables to spending. The most significant relationship that we're looking at in that model is between spending and outcomes for students. And we're establishing what is the relationship between an investment or amount of money that is spent on a student and what that outcome would produce for a student in Utah. And one of the sub-analyses directly to your question is that what this statistical model can do is basically hold constant other things that we know create noise in identifying the relationship, in this case, between cost and outcome. So we can ask the question, if we hold all other variables constant, what is the relationship between spending and outcome for an English learner student? And how does that relationship vary in different settings? So for example, does that differ when you have a small population of EL students? Does that differ when there's a large population of EL students? And what that allows us to understand is then to basically make a comparison of what the model is showing us in comparison to what the current allocation of resources is in the state of Utah. So naturally, what you'll start to see is some variance between either district to district or across the state in terms of resources that are being distributed to some of those populations. Some states do better than others.
Yeah, follow up. Hang on, there you go.
In the state of Utah, respective to the LEA. Is that correct?
We can break it down to the LEA level. The analysis that we typically conduct in this circumstance is actually a school level analysis that gives us an even finer tuned look
Great.
at the interaction that's happening in those environments.
Thank you.
So I've got a question, and I think you've answered it once before, but I'm sure board members are asking, or been thinking of this along this way, is that within this study, and now we're going into this next phase, is this is all about funding and data, and it's not about a competition or individual performances between different LEAs. And because that's what is not part of this are the decisions that those local boards are making, and specifically that some may have superstar resources versus others are up and coming and all that. So this is, for us, it's not, when this is done, it's not going to give us the answers that we need, but it's going to give us information that we'll probably ask more questions on how and what we can do as policymakers moving forward. So this isn't going to truly show those inequitable places. It depends on your definition of equity, but so I'm just, in managing our board's expectations, this next round definitely is an eye-opener for us, but is not going to say, this is where you're broke. This is exactly what you need to do. This is just giving us data so we can make an informed decision moving forward. Is that right, Tiffany? So it's not going to really get down into the weeds to say, okay, you got to change these policies ASAP and why. Will you comment on that? I've had board members ask me, but they haven't asked in here, so that's why I'm bringing this up.
And I'm sure that they can round this out. But I think a way to think about it, the scope did request that they make recommendations based on the findings. But that being said, it is unlikely to be to step on the toes of the policy decisions that should be left to policymakers. So it may be more closer to considerations and options than do X, Y, Z.
I think that's kind of very well put by the Chief of Staff. Justin, myself, and the rest of the team at Weston and APA, I think we very well understand our role and where that line stops and where your role picks up. To the degree that we can provide through those findings and recommendations clarity about what the facts and evidence are saying, in indicating to both you and other policymakers in Utah about what action you could take specific to your state school funding formula. We certainly will deliver that in a formal report, but we have also continued to work with states informing those recommendations all the way through the policymaking process. But to the next phase of the report, to your point, we won't be delivering a written bill for you all to adopt. But we have worked with states in the past in order to arrive at some of those conclusions for their circumstances.
Okay. Board Member Earl?
Yeah, so you just brought up, when you were talking just a minute ago, I just wondered, because our auditor in the state is also doing some finance things with education, are you coordinating with him at all?
Yes, in fact,
You are, okay.
some of the data that they've been collecting, the school level
used-
analysis that
okay.
I was referencing from Member Davis, they are sharing some of that
And I guess
with
that's
us.
why that popped into my mind. I wondered, I thought, this seems like we've heard this. So.
Yes, so
Yeah.
some of the there is some data
Okay.
sharing that's happening there. I will say that there are some very distinct differences
Uh-huh.
in the types of analysis that we're conducting versus the state audit.
Sure, I just wondered, because it seems like somewhat of a dual purpose. Maybe there's some different outcomes on both ends, or some different ways of going about it, but I just was curious, so, all right, thank you.
Board Member Davis?
In your data here, did you include all certified adults in the student-teacher ratio? For example, a librarian or a school counselor as a student-teacher ratio?
So remember, we had both the teachers per and then separately the certified staff per. So
Somewhere else.
there should be the two. I will go back and check and just make sure. Yeah. We had looked at both of those pieces. I'll make sure that if we didn't get them all on the table, we can get you both of those.
I see certified staff per 1,000 ADM, but on teacher-student ratio, those seem so low to me. I just cannot imagine that counselors or librarians or someone wasn't included in that. If not, then I will do a happy dance on this desk right now.
I will confirm
Can we?
and get
yeah,
back.
I'd
let's-
love to see it.
Where's that
actually in
happy dance?
schools.
Okay. Yeah, so we've got, I think, 3 more sections for you. We've got 20 minutes. So we're gonna move relatively quickly. So I'm not gonna bury the lead on this one. The next section talks about state and local revenue proportions by state and source, and effectively what we are trying to ascertain here is there a right split? You know, is there a correct split for how much the state should be paying as a total percentage and how much locals should be paying? And the answer is no, and we'll walk through why. These tables show you that there's huge variation in that split. So Vermont funds nearly 90% of their educational program from the state, whereas Illinois only funds about a quarter. Utah is at around 55%, and the national average is around 50% when you think of state funding. And so Utah is a little higher than the national average on state funding, a little lower than local, and a little lower on federal. But what we wanted to take a look at is there any relationship between that state-local share and the overall equity of the system? And to do that, we turn to Ed Week's equity score. They look at every school finance formula. They give every school finance formula an equity score. And just ran a basic correlation between that ratio, that state-local split, and those equity scores. And it turns out the correlation was almost as close to 0 as you could get. I mean, I think we had to get out to like 7 decimal points to get any differential. So you can have an equitable system with the state fully funding. You could have an equitable system with the local fully funding. I actually think it's a little harder to do it that way. But in the end, that split doesn't dictate the equity, again, in the school finance lens of your system. And one of the things we wanted to talk about is that states do have different approaches to determining what is in the RFP as this idea of a reasonable local contribution. So Maryland is an example of a state that back in the early 2000s made a decision that for state funding purposes, every one of their formulas, and they happen to have 4 different funding formulas, would be a 50-50 split state-local. And so what that means very specifically is that you determine the overall funding, let's say around $3 billion. The state is going to pick up half of that, and then the locals have to pick up the other half, which actually means local effort has to float over time. If the locals are more wealthy or less wealthy in general, you have higher or lower tax rates because the amount the state is picking up is totally fixed. So that's just an approach that Maryland uses, and they did it very specifically because they had very low state share when they redid their formula, and they wanted to kind of put a marker in the ground that the state was going to pick up more. Other states are much more like Utah, where they have a required local contribution, so basically a tax effort, a level of effort that every local community has to make, and then beyond that, the state is equalizing those dollars. So as locals have more or less wealth, it changes how much the state has to pick up. Examples of that are Ohio and Wisconsin, and you can find states who have higher local contribution than Utah. That simply is requiring a higher effort locally. And then there's the question of if you have local revenues kind of in excess of that required amount. And there's really 3 approaches to that. We list 2 here. The first is what we call recapture. So if district has their local effort and it can raise more money than the formula would say they need, that money goes back to the state. Wyoming is a state that does a full recapture of every dollar. Nevada, on the other hand, has a local required effort, and the locals keep all of that, even if it kind of goes beyond. They don't set a limit of what's needed. It's simply this is raised locally, and they keep every dollar. The third approach, which many states use, is they simply say if we're requiring, let's make it up, 20 mills, and you can raise everything you need locally at 10, then you only do 10. And so what we talked about this morning is the three of them basically place equity in different pots. So in a Wyoming approach has both student and taxpayer equity kind of stay the same, right? Everybody's being treated exactly the same. Nevada is allowing taxpayer equity, everyone's paying the same thing, but it allows somewhat to have some issues with student equity because there are certain communities who raise a ton of money and it stays local. And then states who cap it actually create taxpayer equity issues. So it turns out there's no perfect way to do this and you're gonna mess up somewhere, right? But you have to pick where you wanna go. And I guess other than Wyoming, which is a little bit more on that equity side across the board. So in phase 2, as we've talked about before, we're going to be looking a lot more at equalization and really tax capacity and effort in the system, which will help us think through that kind of reasonable local effort as we get through with the phase 2 part of the study. So questions there, and if not, we will.
Not seeing any.
Okay. We're going to keep cranking. Methods for student count. This was another piece. Effectively, states count students at district level mostly, both for accountability, but a lot of it is really so that they can fund. They can create a state funding formula. States have different systems because they might want to create different incentives, and they might want to have a different level of precision. So incentives could be, are you incentivizing attendance or not? Levels of precision are, do you want to count students once or twice and then not worry about the flow the rest of the year? Or do you want to count students every day? You here in the state, of course, have a full year ADM. So you're really looking at the membership every day of the year. And then you also have requirements both about the number of days, the 180, and the number of hours, the 990, which are a part of your kind of overall counting and your accountability system. So it turns out every state has a student count. Most of them, there's about 3 or 4 different names you would hear, and yet every single state counts students differently. So you could hear average daily membership, but if you look under the hood, some count for 10 days, some count for 20 days, some count for 180 days, some have rules about when you're in and out of membership, some don't. Some states count attendance versus membership. A number of states use a single day count. That's usually around end of September, early October, 1 day count, that's it. You have a portion of that for your growth lens, but your overall count really is you're looking at this over time. And then some states use multiple counts, so they might just go in 3 or 4 times a year to count. And then when you talk about average, we talked about you could either be short, maybe the first 20 days of the school year or the first 20-day window, or like the state counting every day, or 100 days, something much longer. A couple implications of student count, membership versus attendance. I'd say 5, 6, maybe 10 years ago, a lot of states started thinking, well, we should go to attendance because it's going to incentivize students going to school and districts making the choice and really making sure kids come to school. What a lot of states found is that you actually just decreased funding to your highest need districts and you increased funding to your lower need districts because districts don't fully control the attendance in their schools. And then the mechanism piece, the single day count, it builds in incentives, and we've heard this in states, pizza parties on a certain day because you're gonna make sure everybody shows up, and you don't have a huge incentive for those kids to come back, at least in the funding lens. And then the average counts over an extended period of time generally give it really that most accurate count of the number of students that districts are serving over time. Declining enrollment and growth. A lot of states have a lot of districts who are declining in enrollment. There's a lot of focus right now about how do you smooth out transitions for districts who are losing kids. It's a little different than Utah where you have a very specific piece on growth and there are just a lot less states right now who are dealing with really rapid growth than are dealing with a lot of decline in their smallest districts. But you can make adjustments into your student count either way, which can flatten out your decline, which can help just some economies of scale for districts, or ensure that you're helping districts who are having real big growth, because especially if you're using a prior year count like you all do. So I've already talked most about this. You've got your average daily membership, adjustment for growth, and then your kind of minimum 180 rule and your 990 hours. What came out of some of the study is that impact on competency-based education. You have a number of districts in your state who are really trying to think through competency-based education. So it's less about time in seat and it's more about what does the student know and how do you measure when students are meeting certain benchmarks. And the count can have a real issue with that. And so we actually held a competency-based group, but we first did some research about what's going across the country, and there's kind of 5 key elements to a competency-based system. The first is that students advance upon demonstrated mastery. The competencies include explicit, measurable, transferable learning objectives that empower students. There is timely and differentiated support for the student needs. This one's really key. The assessment is meaningful. When you talk about competency-based, you could talk about, some really are talking about completion-based or getting a grade versus actual competency. You know, best practice is to be ensuring students have a competency, not simply an A or B in some course. And that learning outcomes emphasize competencies, including, you know, the application of that knowledge. Utah is very much in line with other states in that states are not creating whole new count systems because competency-based is coming on. They're trying to figure out how do you take into account competency-based within their count system. Again, we've already talked about you want to ensure that you have that completion and the competency, not just getting done with the coursework. And then something that is in both your, I think, summary and in the report is that we did hold kind of a working group that's going to keep meeting on this competency-based. And the belief is that some of the restrictions districts feel they're facing on funding, which is that it's hard to incentivize a student to do something outside of the regular school day because the district doesn't get funded for that, really are more about rules that are in statute or rules that are in place versus laws. And so there probably could be some changes in rules which would free up and have some more flexibility for competency-based versus having to make a big change in your overall student count to get that done. Left you 9 minutes.
So, Chair, do you want to take any questions, or you want to? We can round out this last piece. All right, there we go. Okay, so last component of our presentation this morning is around our review of year-round schooling. 2 of the most common approaches to thinking about schooling in this country are a single track and multi-track. A single track really being all students are on the same calendar. You've got 45 days on, 15 days off, 60 on, 20 off. And then the multiple track that basically will then stagger that definition as I just reviewed and could get up to as many as 3 tracks maybe existing at any given time. This is a sample is also included in the summary and the full report of what that single track versus a multi-track looks like in terms of just some of the ground setting here. Important here around year-round schooling, YRS, is that historically, it really, the promotion of this idea of year-round schooling has really been driven by growth, student enrollment growth. You can see in places there in the late 1960s, early 70s, kind of Missouri, Illinois, Minnesota, California, all moving to year-round schooling in multi-track circumstances in an effort to really deal with growth, population growth. So in many circumstances, like the facility creation for those students just could not keep up with the population growth, the rapid population growth. Here in Utah, year-round schooling kind of increased in the late 80s and early 90s, kind of surging in 1987. And by 1991, there were 65 schools here in the state that were year-round schools. What we find around the relevant research, we broke this out into 3 topics: impact on student achievement, impact on costs, and then local impact and support. What we generally find across all of these different topics relative to year-round schooling is it's fairly mixed. And a lot of the circumstances that you set up within those local circumstances will dictate the positive impact directly that year-round schooling has on the outcome of students, the impact on costs, or local impact and support. So implementation here in Utah, we found a couple of things that had come up between 90 and 95. A small study examined the implementation here in Utah. Though the research methods were quite limited, the authors did suggest some evidence of impact on student achievement. We'd put a footnote by that, the research methods that were used there. And more recently, a Salt Lake Tribune article kind of examined the public's reaction to a shift away from year-round schooling. And what you can see here is a bit of a divergence, quite quite stark actually, in which the author found that while 80% of the teachers opposed the move, 70% of the parents were in support. So no surprise in terms of some of those cultural expectations across that segregation of stakeholders. So some of the implications for phase 2 with this, going into some deeper investigation. So having identified and knowing the different schools that are using year-round schooling, we were talking earlier with Member Davis's question about the introduction of the cost function analysis, in which we can use this as a variable and try to understand if statistically if this is having any impact on outcomes for students in that initial phase. I'd also add a subsequent bullet if in the identification of the schools that will be used in the successful schools investigation, that one of them is a year-round school or the district operates that also creates an opportunity for us to go a little bit deeper in understanding those practices in those school and district settings. So I think with that, I just wanted to sum up very quickly the kind of phase 1 implications in thinking about phase 2. Both this slide and the next slide really just regard the different areas in which each of these early findings will be feeding into future stages of the work. And I think wanting to put a cap on a point of emphasis that the Chief of Staff mentioned earlier, that over the course of this calendar year, we really are working with the staff. We're developing a timeline now to think about being able to surface findings throughout the course of the year. So we don't want this to go kind of radio silent for 9 months, and then you see us pop back up in 10 months. Over the course of this coming year, we want to create opportunities to engage with the staff, including the superintendent, her team, and others, to present some of these findings as you think about and contemplate some of these changes. And we will say from an effective practice standpoint, we fully endorse that. In particular, as you think about some of these changes that might be coming up in the next legislative session, being able to get feedback, to garner support for some of these potential changes, and doing that early and often, I think will fit with the kind of phased approach that we're discussing currently with the staff. So with that, again, just again, a lot of gratitude for the time with you all this morning. I'm happy to take any closing questions, but I know lunch is right around the corner.
There we go. We'll take some questions now. Board Member Lear.
I have a couple completely unrelated. You mentioned that, and tell me if it just is not part of your analysis, but you mentioned that Utah had a lower percentage of federal funding. Not dramatically, I recall you saying, but lower. Do you have any understanding or explanation of why?
Remember, most federal funding is student population related. And so if your relative overall student population around especially economically disadvantaged or special education students is lower, you'll tend to get a little bit lower federal funding. So that is a general statement. I'm not saying that's exactly why that would happen
But that
here.
makes sense.
But we know the overall need level is a little lower.
Okay, and then, go ahead.
Just to add a footnote on that, I heard a small snippet of the earlier board meeting, and Superintendent Dixon had mentioned the importance of the census. So those census can, just to link these two things together, the census count is a vital piece of information that is used by those federal agencies, the Department of Ed, Health and Human Services, to distribute federal funds. So ensuring that count is accurate will ensure that the appropriate set of funds under those circumstances reach Utah.
Yeah, and there are a lot, I can see there are a lot of factors that might influence why it's accurate or less than accurate in some states versus others.
And then the only other factor, so Mississippi is the state who by far receives the most federal funds. They both have high need, but they also have extremely high effort. They spend a very large percentage of their overall wealth on K-12 ed. They just have very low wealth.
Right.
And so that is one of the other factors in the federal formulas is actually the state's overall effort.
Which explains because Utah has gone from 7th to 37th. So that explains that. My last question.
Okay.
You referred a lot to districts, but you've looked across the country, and many of them have charter schools like Utah does. I don't know if many states have as many charter schools as Utah does, and I would guess, an educated guess, that per capita, we have a lot more charter schools than almost any state. But I wonder if you have any general conclusions about if states' fiscal well-being is influenced by large numbers of charter schools, any charter schools. Do you have any sense of that, or is that just something that you have not looked at all?
So I will, for full disclosure, say I'm on a charter board. So
Okay.
just to put that out there
Everybody's
before I
got a
start talking about
bias,
charters. But I think one of the things that makes it difficult to talk about is that the governance structure about how charters are funded differs state to state. So, for example, many states, charters are actually funded through their school district. And so it's different than if they're separate LEAs and funded separately. So it can get a little harder to make that sort of conclusion. So I don't think I could probably make that conclusion right now. Charters will be a part of our look as we're looking for those case study schools. So we're going to be looking at any school who's doing a job for students that is statistically significantly different than a comparison school. It's not quite that simple, but within the analysis. So they will be part of the overall analysis as we get into this second phase.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
From a research field perspective, there's been very little actually that's been conducted. I think from an independent and objective perspective, there are some groups out there that have published some work on this topic. WestEd is going to be producing some work this year, looking at developing some designs to understand that relationship more substantially. What we can say from some of our descriptive analyses, looking at several states, that charters may have an impact on school districts' financial health, but we're largely coming up with kind of three factors that have influence over that. So the first is really about how the school district manages its own operation, right? And so this really kind of speaks to the kind of support and the expertise of leaders like the superintendent and the CFO that are really important in guiding the management of that operation in the context of charters. The second factor is really around the kind of speed and volume by which charters are introduced. So in states where over time you've seen kind of a slower growth in charter schools, the traditional public school sector has been able to adjust to those changes. But where you see extraordinarily rapid growth, those other public school districts in the region really struggle. The third factor is really about how state policy is constructed in the funding of charter schools. And so in some circumstances, there are places in which the actual transfer of resources from the school district to the charter school happen at very inopportune times within the year. One very explicit example of that is transfers have to happen of revenues after staffing has been set by the school district for the coming year. And if there's bargaining unit agreements that limit the ability of the district to then adjust to those staffing, it creates some tension with the ability of the district to think about its management of financial resources.
And just to conclude, I am not a numbers person, so I very much appreciate that you've made this understandable to me and mostly. And I really, really appreciate your seeming objectivity and again, your very eloquent presentation and helpful presentation. Thank you.
Board Member Davis?
Oh, can you add charters as a category into all of these graphs? For purposes of an overall assessment? I mean, they are funded equally, but
Sounds like a
on-
change of scope here.
Like on page 40,
Okay,
there's no mention of
So member
charters.
Davis, I appreciate the question. I will not commit to that publicly. My staff will boil me after we're done. I will certainly have a conversation with the USB staff about incorporating, and I will say that for the next phase of the analysis, both the statistical and if they are identified for the successful schools will include charter schools as well.
And just to get an overall picture. Thank you.
Yes.
Board Member Earl?
Thank you. Just 2 comments. I think there is some integration in here, or I read some, as far as charters, some of the graphs, some of the numbers, and maybe it's not pulling out specifically all the, this and the that, so maybe Cindy's asking for just a little bit more than that. And this is just a general thought on tax effort. that, and I understand the difference between a state and a local, but really all taxes are local, meaning they come from people, right? Even federal is local. So in the juggling around of taxes, we just have to do what works for each community, right? And I think that's kind of what you said, is that each state even is different in the way they're structured. So it's interesting to try to even compare that sometimes to try to figure out exactly what is the best model, when really every state's different, and not only the culture, but even the resources available in the state, and so the way they produce. So anyways, it'll be exciting to see what you guys come up with, so.
Tiffany, can you share with the board that, I mean, this is our study, but there's some legislators that have been following this from the very beginning, and they get updates and that. Can you speak to the board of who they are? And
Yeah.
I was thinking, I don't want to leave any out, or I would do it, but
I
but they were
might.
very
I don't know if-
interested and patient with this progress, or
Yeah.
with the progress here.
So we've been, obviously, in order for this to really, translate into meaningful policy, it would be in partnership with the legislature and our other governing partners. So from the beginning, we've been engaged with them on developing the scope of work, as well as reviewing some of the initial findings, and we'll continue to engage with them through this process. So it's been like the chairs of the Public Education Appropriation Subcommittee, chairs of Education Interim, and members of leadership that have been involved in those conversations. But moving forward, we've talked about a desire to, as these findings are coming out in the spring and summer, to have those also go before, education interim committees and public education appropriation, so that there's very public conversations, in addition to coming before the board, so.
Thank you. So this is a little bit bigger than us, and there's quite a few eyes on this. I want to thank Tiffany for her work and patience with me on some of these things as this has been moving forward. And Jason and Justin, thank you. Excited to see where this is at as we go, even in your executive summary. Again, it's when this study is done and other states probably want to have access and look at us, it's like we absolutely are very unique. And to even go back to Board Member Davis's comments earlier, as the board member comments about moving forward, our state is continuing to even be more unique, and so we're constantly looking for those improvements or betterments. And this is what it's all about. It's not about what is broke, but it's about what should we be doing to better address the needs of our students, and also the needs of our state, to putting the right people, having the right people here to take care of the work that gets done here. So it's making good citizens and that whole package. So thank you for your work on this. We look forward to updates and then also the conclusion of this phase. So thank you. Did you have any closing comments?
No.
Okay. Well, thank you for being here. I was tempted to try to squeeze Scott Jones in between us and lunch, but it wouldn't be fair, and the cameras and the press are not here yet, so we're going to break.
And I don't fit, so.
All right, so we'll Deputy Superintendent Scott Jones will have you on our agenda right after lunch. Are you okay with that? All right, so board members, enjoy your lunch, and let's try to start promptly in here. I'll try to round you up about 5 minutes or so before we start, so thank you.